It was interesting because I was talking to Johannes from Halcyon about this off the record about the ideology within design practices. And one aspect is absolutely nudge theory in terms of guardrails, basically mediation of populations via indirect systems and structures. And that if we can nudge people in certain behaviors, that will be a better policy position. Now, designers use this all the time for design purposes to nudge users to act certain ways to buy certain things. And the corollary with it, with Johannes I brought up, was the ideology of friction. So in the sense that our job as designers is to min-max our way to removing friction from every interaction. If we remove friction, this means higher velocity of transactions, and that means profit for our customers and clients. This is why we get paid what we get paid, is because that's what we're doing. We're minimizing friction. Actually, the most ideal scenario is no friction in any way. Just attune, basically once there's an attunement, and then you basically just get people get subsumed into consumption or behavioral habits. So just kind of this double move of the nudge is it's almost to orient, the kind of move the subject, the user, to a certain habituation. And then once you're in that habituation, to then remove all friction from this action from not happening. So I just find that interesting, that I think it's important from a design perspective, which is not this typical kind of control theory, kind of control design operation aspect, to talk through what those distinctions would be. And I think those are two elements about it: nudge theory and friction.
No, I think that's wonderful. And Michael, it is good to see you as well. So the ultimate lack of friction is to think it and it is thus. So the Neuralink, no friction through time, no friction through effort. It just is all the case. And the question becomes, of course, what is it the human loses when they lose friction? I think in a quantitative analysis or a market analysis, you say nothing. The loss of friction is inherently good. But if there's something about friction in some circumstances that creates virtue, or that creates resilience, or that creates a mode of being that otherwise would not be possible, then the loss of friction in any and all circumstances could be a problem. And yet, definitely there are many times where I get pissed off if something entails friction. So one of the most horrible things ever is trying to make a Mac product work with a Windows product. And Michelle hears me talking because we're trying to back up her photos. And why is it that Windows makes it so freaking impossible to plug up a phone and get pictures? I was hot. Oh my, I hate Mac. I'm sorry, I'm not saying Mac's a bad, but I've never had a good experience with Mac, ever. So that's an example where removal of friction probably would have saved me 3 hours of insanity. So I don't mean to say that friction is a good in its own right, but there is something to be said about the removal of friction entirely. Seems to be very problematic. And so what is the difference between removing friction to increase the qualitative experience of the user versus removing the friction of, say, a government in order to control people in a certain direction? Because if I, as a central planner, remove all friction down course X, and there's X, Y, and Z, and I want you to do X, then maybe I have incentive as the state to remove friction down X so that it becomes easier, so more and more people do that, where actually Y and Z could be better. But I don't make a point to remove friction there because I actually don't want people to go down those paths. Of course, there may be certain paths, like the development of virtue, path Y, that actually cannot remove friction entirely without ceasing to be itself. But how do you tell the difference between beneficial friction and non-beneficial friction? Necessary friction and non-necessary friction. Friction you can remove without changing the essence of the thing, and friction you cannot. I think that is an interesting question. I think also, I've also been thinking, I had a talk with Javier on discourse and language, and obviously the Kirk situation. I think you see nudging occur in dialogue 24/7. Like, if nudging seems to be an abstract systems theory, people nudge each other constantly in dialogue. Where if I ask you, do you want to have salmon for dinner? And you go, oh, salmon, yeah, that'd be okay. You don't want to straight up say no, but you want to nudge me to kind of go, oh, okay, actually they want salad. My bad. Oh, actually, you know what? Why don't we do salad tonight? Great. And that's a way, because you don't want to just say, no, I don't want fish, I want salad, because then you'd be responsibility for the choice and may feel bad for inconveniencing me. So what you want to do is say it in such a way where you're nudging me to get what you want without responsibility. I think humans do this to one another all the time because, as I was speaking with Echomancer, on is this kind of idea that there's a strong connection in cybernetic theory with language, systems, communicative action, et cetera, so forth. And there's something about language that is constantly suggesting a nudge theory. And I think what we spoke on Kirk, and I'll give it to Michael here, we're just seeing perpetual nudging. Like people are nudging one another in the direction of their interpretation of the events. They're nudging one another via the emotional cadence of what is said. Because I guess why I'm using the term nudging, because you say, well, it's not really nudging. That's more of a systems thing. It's persuasion. But actually, I think what we see is people in dialogue nudging because they won't directly tell you what to think or maybe directly sort of engage in a debate. I think a lot of people think they're debating, but actually what they're doing is suggesting if you take the other side, you're immoral. There's kind of more of a sort of indirect power that is kind of at play. But I think those are just some thoughts. Nudging is extremely important as something to think. And what is the difference between someone? I think it would be erroneous to say nudging in any and all circumstances is bad, because nudging can help a user have a better experience. But what is the difference? What happens when nudge is used by power or by people who think they know what's best for you, that assume the outcome and nudge you in that direction, and then you get the outcome and it's not the best? But I'll pass it. Michael, do you still want to speak, sir? I'll give it to you, and then Daniel, because I saw your hand up, but if it went down, it's no problem.
I unfortunately have to go for like 20 minutes. So
That's no problem.
Daniel, take the reins. I will see you at the bottom of the hour.
You are a gentleman. We'll see you, sir. I'll give it to Daniel and then Jockin. Daniel, good to have you, sir.
I mean, first off, I want to say I think the conversation that OG Rose released last Friday with Luke, Benka, I don't know, I'm getting the surname wrong, but that was really fantastic. It's feeding these thoughts for me. I know Daniel last net you were speaking in terms of the knowledge of good and evil, and that we're kind of experiencing just the outpouring of the consequences of that. I'm thinking more and more along those terms, or finding the usefulness of that frame. And for me, this like the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is a very like important piece of it. Because then the way that I think about that in terms of specifically the body, or like the reactive body, and on this theme of nudging, like the sense that I've had in the content that I've seen and in the conversations that I've heard, is there's this like implicit nudging in conversational spaces, nudging for the other to take a certain position, which I'm reading as this like eating the fruit of a certain determination of good and evil, so that it can be relied upon that you will react in a certain way in the future without it being a site of friction. So it's like, it's a nudge that you just take in this knowledge of good or evil, so that we can rely on your steady and frictionless ascent to the correct position on this moral issue. And it's been interesting and scary to just watch this unfolding, to watch this I mean, so adding that, the nudge, the nodule, and then just something I came across today in the context of speech and the cost of speech and the cost of one's speech. It's just an image that I'm going to leave as the last thing I say, is that the tongue is like the rudder. The tongue is like a rudder. It's a very like an ancient Greek kind of, or at least a more ancient metaphor or image. Like, it's so small, the rudder is so small in the ship, but it has such a steering consequence. So in terms of like the nudging of the social body and the nudging of one another in conversation, like the effects of our tongue, it's immense. The words that we let slip, because of the nudge that we've come to unthinkingly take this determination of this is the correct posture on this issue. Yeah, my initial notes. Otherwise, I've been reading the the book of Job, which I've read before, but it's I'm approaching it in a new way. But I'm going to put it down here.
Outstanding. I'll give it to Jockin, and thank you for listening to that talk with Luke. I have more and more appreciated Gurdjieff as being different from many of the other people that are considered in the shamanic tradition. I think there is a very significant emphasis on this mystery of what Cleo brought up a few weeks ago, that there is something about humans that is able to create a unique kind of energy that is not found in nature. And look, when Michelle and Jockin and Javier were speaking of Geopadia, this mystery of how is it you can have 3 hours of sleep and be ready to go? How can you have an energy of a conversation that goes hours and hours? There's a certain energy that seems capable of the human to bring out. And I think if we locate Gurdjieff as extremely interested in tapping into that and what are the conditions of the possibility of that, I think we see something very useful. And then what would it mean to have a global society, global networks of which are bringing out that spirit, bringing out that energy? I was speaking with Echomantra and Cybernetics and Lumen, et cetera, so forth, and it makes me think of this notion of all causation is personal. Like there is a personal causation that is not reducible to billiard balls. Like I am capable of bringing cause and effect into reality that cannot be brought into reality except by a personal source, right? Well, that personal causation can be seen as an expression of the energy that Gurdjieff is getting at. That energy that also, I think, is the energy that is evidence of health in the way that Jockin is speaking about it. That is the prerequisite to metaphysics. Without this energy, I don't think one can sustain themselves in this activity to bring forth this new kind of being, this new form of subjectivity. That makes me think of the address that Javier and I were speaking about yesterday that seems to be completely necessary so we don't fall into an address of the imaginary or the symbolic, centralized, decentralized, which is some things, or one of the options brought out in Attack on Titan, because that's one of the great political science works of our time. So I think I also am more and more, there's this idea in orthodoxy that God would have let us eat from the knowledge of good and evil. We just weren't ready for it. We were too young, we ate it early. And if I were to put that notion together more and more with the way I'm kind of thinking about forgiveness as giving back the knowledge of good and evil, it's giving back the knowledge of undeveloped, immature good and evil in order to be able to handle the proper knowledge of good and evil, of which then, of course, is necessarily situated in a relationship with God, which we could talk about the beautiful. Like you can't have the knowledge of good and evil without the beautiful, I don't think. And also, it is interesting to think if, like you say, the discourse, the dialogue, right, whether it's Kirk or et cetera, so forth, there's a certain of step into this gutter, as Javier said, this structure, this form that's going to lead you on, and there's no friction. The bowling ball just goes through the gutter, right? It's going to miss the pin, but there's no friction. And how you actually, in a way, have to add friction to yourself to not just fall into one of the conversational scripts. You have to deal with the negativity of not giving into the framing that the person you're speaking with is bringing forth, right? And so it's very interesting because now I'm thinking about this topic of friction. It's almost like the C.S. Lewis first things first, second things too, but if you put second things first, you lose both. If you put the frictionlessness first, then you're in the gutter and you get trouble. But if you put the friction first, then you can actually move toward virtue and beauty. And then you could also argue that the only thing that would sustain you through friction is beauty, right? Is that correct? Now, the interesting question, almost from a design, and this I don't know, at what point is the design so, I want to say fitting, maybe, that it is actually, in a sense, nudging, but it's more so attracting, or it is flowing? Because there seems to be, perhaps a distinction here can be made between a certain a certain flow that the great artist has in the nudge of a government that's trying to convince its people to do something. Like there's a certain elegance. Maybe there's a difference between elegance and nudge that could be considered here. Because it seems like a great designer that is employing a kind of nudge is also actually working with a certain elegance that then is actually participating in the beautiful. Whereas nudging in the way that Cass and Sunstan and them refer to it is more of a nudging for good ends vectors of the good that the system establishes. I'm not sure, but maybe there's some sort of distinction there that can be thought. And again, I don't want to say nudging bad, non-nudging good, but there's some sort of sublation of nudging and a certain elegance that design can accomplish. That seems different from me of saying, how do we get more people to use solar energy because we think if they don't, the world's going to end. Well, let's make it really difficult to buy gasoline. Let's put some friction up so that they're going to get solar. And you go and that kind of nudging, there may be a difference there, but I'm not sure. But let me give it to Mr. Thomas Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Well, two notes on this. One, well, a couple of notes. I think first one is on the discourse discussion. A lot of that is about anchor. It's the concept of anchoring. What I mean is that it doesn't even matter the position. Like, it's actually the extreme of the positions that forces a kind of Overton window kind of negotiation without actually implicitly doing it. So actually, as a strategy people do in rhetoric, in discourse and rhetoric, where they'll purposely make a strong position statement that's actually untenable on purpose, just to move the conversation in their direction. Because we can't help ourselves. We always are responding to what's relative in relationship to us. I think another aspect, obviously, this is a huge. This issue of smoothness it's deeply embedded. It's a huge problem because Plato in Philebus says beauty absolutely is what's smooth, clear, and pure in tone. He uses tone in music and in figure for geometry, and it's geometric. He uses by the geometric figure is beautiful because it has those qualities. So what are we to do in terms of like talking through this? I actually think it's in terms of my gut instinct or like gut thought about to respond to it. I think it's memory on both sides, and specifically tied to fluency. I'll say to explain what I mean. When we are fluent in a language, we're not aware of it. We have a smooth experience using a language because we're fluent in it. When we're in an account, like Plato, for example, the fact that literally I'm like, we're discussing this, and I just remember Plato, and I remembered, you see, like that's a double move of, it's like the breaks in fluency. Basically, fluency allows you to forget kind of automaticity in terms of Ebert's discussion. But at the same time, fluency gives you the groundworks that have this kind of recalled memory to kind of recollect that puts the brakes on the smoothness of the transition or the interaction. And the main thrust of it, I think, to answer your question is, I think it is about personal virtue. Like what nudging is about is it's a cybernetic system to say individuals don't have to have responsibility for their virtue. We can just aggregate this to a system to make them good by what we assess as good, right? So it's a kind of universal law applying. It doesn't understand the nature of virtue as a particular thing, like your health is personal. Now, is there a relationship of systems and to individuals? Yes, there is. Health is actually an aspect of that. How an urban space is designed, or if you're getting pollutants put in the air, will affect the health of individuals. So there is give and take here, but it's not. But at the same time, it is not absolute universals only that the state or the cybernetic system is what's actually going to give us virtue and health, for example. So I think that relates to, again, actually an issue of like kind of paradigma attraction, right? So instead of these vectors of goodness, if you always notice, it's always algorithmic. These kind of cybernetic systems that say, I want you to do this, not this. So we just kind of on off switch it, very kind of binary, versus a more kind of quote a thematic paradigm of a kind of how might people approach this in different ways. With the assumption, with the understanding that individuals are going to have to make these decisions. The pattern can help create a populational trend, right? But it says with the assumption, the kind of like as you said, Daniel, it's kind of personal causation, the exemplar causation, exemplary causation. This is one way to talk about this. So this is attached to with fluency, right? But it's fluency in both in the sense of like virtue is the activity of smooth activity, right? The draw forth. And we have to have a certain groundwork of that to get everything off the ground. But at the same time, we also need that fluency also needs to be connected with memory and recollection. And that's actually the moment of friction, right? They're trying to put the brakes on, just the consumptionary, just like if I feel my desire, just get what I want, they have to recollect and recall. And it's always key. It's very human because it's only at the moment it matters, right? So that's always individuated, and that's all of a particular context. Yeah, those are good points. Okay.
No, I appreciate that very much. And Cleo, wonderful to have you, and I hope you're doing well. I mean, on this idea of smoothness, there seems to be a difference between a certain smoothness of the beautiful and a smoothness to the good. And that the smoothness to the good is where you start getting manipulation or where you get a discourse in politics. Because what happens if you're in a conversation with people who are getting carried away, saying this, that, and so forth? The smoothness would be to agree. And there's a way in which rationality, as autonomous, is bound to the smooth. Like it can't help but go in the smooth direction, right? Because that is going to reduce friction, right? So there's a kind of, I want to say, geometry and interactions where we tend to kind of move toward almost like a gutter. Like what is smooth is what you tend to go to, and then you're in the gutter and you go from there, right? And because you remove friction by doing that. And why in the world would you create friction in your relationships unless there was some, dare I say, higher value, like the beautiful or the true or what you think is right, that you would take that risk? If you don't believe in those things or don't think that they should have an impact, or then you may just end up kind of in a discourse. And you could say that discourse tends to locate smooth gutters, smooth channels, and people tribalize around a certain smoothness that they locate, a collective consciousness, and they kind of organically move in that direction, and then everyone just goop, goop. You're like the bowling ball in the gutter, and I keep using this metaphor over and over again. You're in this gutter, it's smooth, the bowl goes, seems to be going in the right direction, it's really close to the pins, but it moves. And I think actually we may overlook how much we naturally head toward the smooth. Now, of course, if you take on friction before you're ready, it may destroy you, right? And I do think there's a massive difference between a certain smoothness, a certain fluidity, a certain elegance of the beautiful that strikes and then leaves, meaning it's not in your control, it has grace, versus a smoothness that you can orchestrate toward a good. That seems to be very different. Like the smooth, like everything that is most dangerous is like that which is most good, the best, right? Like, the most dangerous things are like idolatry is so bad because it's like the gods, right? Like it is like divinity. Thus, it can be so dangerous, right? And so the certain sort of smoothness of the dance of joy, the fluidity of relationships, that precisely, which has to come and go in terms of beauty and be earned through virtue and taking on friction, is dramatically different from, and yet like in the experience of the smoothness of avoiding friction, until one day the surprise occurs and the smoothness of the good versus the smoothness of the beautiful, I suppose, turns out to have been making you fragile, and then trouble occurs, and then it's too late. Things fall apart. I think also, though, this is tied to memory and discernment, because the ability, like there is this idea in religion of a certain spiritual discernment, and even the idea that discernment is one of the highest virtues, as Echo was pointing at, is this idea that if you can't discern the difference between these things, then you don't have agency, actually, because you are not able to tell the difference, and so you just kind of get pulled along. I think also interesting with this, and then I'll give it to Daniel, is that this is one of the reasons why it is, I think, important to complexify smoothness, is because the suggestion here is that smoothness in discourse as a gutter, say with the Kirk situation or et cetera, so forth, that people are seeking a certain trajectory that is embedded in the words themselves. This actually suggests a determinism. Like seeking the smooth actually then sets you in a deterministic course that sort of just carries you along. And yet some people may associate the feeling of smoothness with freedom and associate the feeling of friction with the loss of freedom, when actually it's the exact opposite. It is actually the feeling of the negativity or feeling the friction that is the possibility of the development of agency, that if you don't have, then you are actually determined. So knowing the meaning of the feelings is very, very important. And where would you even get that education or training, or where would you even get the ability to discern the difference in the meaning of feelings? I think what you're saying on virtue is also a very big deal. I think nudging does try to replace virtue. I think virtue is the only way to have sufficient differentiation in a cybernetic system that is going to make it adaptable to any of all possible circumstances, whereas a nudge theory is either going to be robust and thus totalitarian, or it will be fragile and prone to chaos. So without virtue, you're going to lack adaptability on the level of the individual. And a system, almost by definition, can, at a certain level of complexity, be adaptable. Because complex systems are those where if one piece doesn't operate in the same way, it breaks and can't be put back together. Where a complicated system can be put back together, like an engine or something. Like the human body, if you took the human body apart, you couldn't put it back together, therefore it is complex. Where an engine, you could take an engine apart and put it back together, therefore it is complicated. So there's that famous complex, complicated distinction. Complex systems really are not sufficiently adaptable precisely because there must be a possible ordering of the system of which then breaks it and it cannot be put back together again. So how do you have adaptability in a complex system? By definition, it has to be on the lowest unit level, the lowest unit of the level, which would be the individuals themselves who make up that system. So the adaptability must come from them bottom up in order for the complex system to be adaptable, and that is only doable via virtue, because virtue is the ability to be sufficiently open and sufficiently closed at the same time, not overly open or openly closed. So I think virtue is very important for cybernetic thinking. But let me give it to Daniel, and then anyone else who'd like to speak. Daniel.
Oh, that's great. Maybe I just want to like point to this part of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, because this is the part of it that has been really I keep returning to it because like you eat the fruit and we make a body out of what we eat. It seems that the thing of relevance is the body that is produced is the problem, or that's the site of, and then you can extend that into a social body. So like a social body that partakes of the same fruit. Now the smoothness that is sought has this individual anatomical resonance of same diet that is distributed between a social body. And so the exchanges that happen seek the non-disruption of that diet, or of the smoothness of that metabolic process. But what's so helpful with I think I know Thomas, you've been working on health, and Daniel, you were using the language of virtue now and pointing to the necessity of the individual, and I tend to come to like the language of the body and the anatomy in this, and if we link this thinking in terms of energies and Luke's work and Gurdjieff, there's something here like a science of worship, or the task of getting worship right. And there's something like a standard, like right worship is that which puts to death the body that is accumulated from eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, I want to say like a side point, which is that I've been thinking about just religious language in general. Like, yeah, you meet a lot of people on the streets who fall into almost a kind of madness and can be seen as crazy for their proximity to a religious language and register. So like if people are speaking just very explicitly and plainly about demons, or even the knowledge of good and evil and etc, then there's something that it's stark. It's stark when that occurs, and it's maybe this indication that something like an ultimacy, or some kind of ground is being revealed in a social body when language gets reduced. But yeah, it's the same thing, that the worst thing is the best thing perverted. So with these things of such power, the power of the reference of our words, just to notice, because I'm speaking very freely about the knowledge of good and evil, and specifically the fruit of eating that. And then just to contribute to the development of the theme of like, I think I get the language from Cadell in terms of higher order tensions like being orientated towards developing higher order tensions. So you nudge away from smoothness so that a higher order tension is sustained, and then you can think about that again in terms of like a social body. And then my thought again and again comes to the development of the anatomy via this process, and however we like chicken and egg in terms of causation, but an individual emphasis is all that one can have in the end of the day. And this is where something like a science of worship or a science of the body, in reference to like specifically how the knowledge of good and evil is held in the bottle. I don't know how we then like speak about that, but we do have resources, like maybe Gurdjieff is one of those, a stranger one, but because it's this background, it's the background question always of something like a telos, like if there's going to be the introduction of friction, or even a steering, like how does steering occur without some implied telos? And then there's maybe this conversation around the good and the beautiful, and we want to not move so much or funnel into a preconceived idea of the good, and so we are averse to certain understandings of telos in that way. But then even with the beautiful, like what is the posture, what is a posture that has the telos that we would affirm, or but that's then kind of pushing into a persisting question for me in this question. Well, what is the telos? But let me pass it back there.
No, fantastic. And Michael, it's good to see you. And if you'd like to speak now, Michael, please. And Christian, wonderful to have you. And congratulations on the work that you've been doing, Christian. And I really like this notion that eating the fruit is digestion and it becomes part of your body. I definitely think that more and more I would like to emphasize that we may say that all day, everyone may say all day long that certainty is impossible. But when you bring up something they disagree with it, boy, howdy, do they communicate it in their body by changing their tone or getting upset. Like many of us actually in our bodies still carry certain positions that intellectually or verbally we may say we know better than. So the thought is not thought until it is digested. And it is interesting as well to think many times when people say, I have to process this, I have to think about that. It's very interesting because that maybe we should say instead, I have to digest that. Maybe philosophy is a process of digesting your ideas. You haven't finished digesting them. They haven't really gone in deep. They haven't become part of your body. And because you haven't digested them, you can't test them through your body to see if they actually are correct, if you will, right? Or actually fitting for the world, et cetera, so forth. So perhaps we can think of philosophy as some sort of digestion of one's ideas, because you're going to have ideas. The question is simply, do you digest them or not, right? And maybe all of the rage we are seeing in the world is people of whom find themselves confronted with their undigested ideas, and in having not digested them, in the frustration of not having brought it into a metabolic process that turns it into a useful energy, the energy just explodes. I definitely always find it interesting that we don't use the metaphor of eating or digestion very much in the culture, and that may actually be a language that better, say, overcomes the mind-body split, which again, most people, if you ask them, do they think, at least nowadays, that there's some sort of hard mind-body split in some sort of sense, or a hard object-subject divide, they may say, no, it's more complicated than that. But actually, in their language or their metaphors, that can still be communicated, whereas something with language, or digestion, I mean, might better get at things. So I appreciate that very much. And I will pass it to anyone who would like to speak. And I think also what you were saying on these higher order tensions and the telos, I think there is a massive difference between, so if we're thinking in terms of a cybernetic system or a system, which is the sort of idea of harmony, this ability to adapt. If I were to ask you, if we want to focus on being prepared versus planning, or the ability to handle surprise, is that based on a telos? you know, on that difference, right? And Kate, wonderful to have you. In a sense it is, but it is also interesting because the ability to handle surprise is a certain training oneself for that of which you cannot name, that you know is probabilistically going to occur. So maybe, you know, I know Javier has talked about Badu and the empty set. It is interesting to think of the empty set, this set, or a telos of lack. Like where you say that actually what it is we need to coordinate our actions. What's most fitting for our action is that of which will make us most prepared for lack, or to remember lack, or to observe lack, or to handle lack, right? This kind of telos, or seems quite different from a telos of which is going to say, put someone in a position to judge the telos, or or to be like, I guess you could also say, what's the difference between a quantifiable telos and a qualitative telos, right? There seems to be difference there. And also there is arguments to be made of the impossibility of acting without something like a telos. There is also questions of a top-down telos that is oppressive, and a telos that emerges from the particulars in virtue and health of which creates adaptability for the system in a manner to increase beauty. There are many differences here, but I'll give it back to you, Daniel, then Jockin, and then Christian. Daniel.
Yeah, just very briefly, and to add on to that idea of telos, it was on my mind because I've been thinking about essentially like developmental difference. So the way that I speak to a 13-year-old or a 7-year-old, and then like there's a steering that's occurring that implies, or like I'm implicated in the steering and the molding. So there's a good that's operative in me doing that. Like there's a telos functioning, and I'm kind of noticing this I guess tendency in myself, and I'm questioning it in myself, like this aversion to certain manners of speech because I know that it complexifies at a later stage. But then actually the 7-year-old and the 13-year-old needs to be told that they have a purpose. Like, but that's a certain something spoken over them, but they actually need that. This is the sense. They need to be told this or fed this kind of speech. And if I refrain from doing that for later philosophical consideration, then it's actually it's a hindrance, or I might be harming. But that's just the kind of the context that telos thinking was coming in, because then development continues to structure relationship. But I'll put it down there.
I think that is a wonderful question. It makes me think of Matthew Stanley's work in the Lacan anthology on differences between esteric and exoteric speech, on full speech, partial speech, all of these different things. I mean, there's something to be said that, you know, as I was speaking with Echomancer, there's this idea of the telos, like if there has to be something that unifies, like a movement up, right? Like in Orthodox theology, there's this idea that the emanation of God creates by creating distinction. So God makes distinction, and that the act of creation is the act of distinction, right? Well, how do you have distinction that doesn't become unintelligible chaos? Because there's no relationality that's possible, right? Well, then you have a movement upward, say the worship of God, or what I'll call the meta judgment of seeing things as similar, as Leibniz say, or Marx might say the commodity form, or beautiful. So then there's a unity you're making, right? So there's also something to say that we could situate a conversation about telos between this movement between up to unify and down to differentiate. If you up in a manner that turns everything into a blob, then there's no relationality because it's the same thing. But if you also split them apart too much and they become too different, it is hard to have relationality and intelligibility, right? So there's a certain sort of active discernment on the proportionality between unity and differentiation that honestly, very often, I think when people use the term telos, they're talking about the right proportion between those. The adequate similarity by which intelligibility is possible, and that a thing is held together in its movement through time, and that holds it together in memory as itself, so that it holds together, moves, but is not isolated. And there is something about fittingness that also is part of that conversation, because there's also something about the telos that unlocks potential that differentiates. And let me explain what I mean by that. If I were to say, you know, and then I'll give it to Jockin and Christian, like if I were to say that a boat can be used as a porch, you go, oh, okay. So I put the board in front of my house and I sit on it in the afternoons. You go, that's interesting. But really what makes a boat is the boat is the fact that it's made for water and that it floats, right? And if I use it as a porch, it is not adequately differentiated as itself from what a porch actually is. So I'm dishonoring what makes it itself in its difference, right? But I'm doing it in order to be creative. Look, I'm creative. I'm using a boat as a porch, or I'm using a boat as a house or something. And maybe in some circumstances that's adequate. And this is where you have to be careful about some sort of universal fittedness for boats, right? But there's also a kind of idea that in the very craft of what a boat is, there's a certain potential, ergo floating and sailing, of which is only unlocked in a certain context of being put on the water. And that if you don't use it that way, there's a certain failure to fittingly honor its difference and what makes it itself, right? But of course you could turn around and say, but then it's just like all the other boats. And it was actually more unique when it was used as a porch, right? So maybe you should do that and then it will be different. And then it's like, well, no, but that's a kind of difference that is inviting chaos, or actually is then in the future perhaps risking boats being arbitrary. So to the degree we use it in a unique way, we better not overdo it to the point where then boats lose their uniqueness. So here's the point. There's a certain flexibility that's going on, right? There's a certain sort of discernment that is going on that is constantly looking for a certain negotiation between adequate sameness and adequate differentiation, ergo the proportion of similarity of the meta judgment that Leibniz. And I think the telos is in conversation with that. Like the teleological is in conversation with the determination of sufficient difference and sufficient sameness in order to honor it in its difference, but not make it so different that it's not intelligibility. And that's a live, flexible judgment. Those are opening thoughts. I will give it to Mr. Jockin and then Christian. Mr. Jockin.
Chloe put in the chat something that caught my attention. So she's talking about Deleuze, specifically the smooth and the striated space. So I got very curious about that. So I did some quick Google scholaring as we were talking. And already off the bat, I got a secondary literature review of it just really quickly. Really interesting point where this commentator is speaking that the smooth and striated space is not a literal point. It's an ethical choice of how to organize our experience. And he goes on to say, this commentator, that the smooth and striated space it's about the being in space and the being for space. Very interesting. I think I need to read more. I just want to share that notes just for say, Chloe, keep coming. That's some great points. I'm sorry you're not feeling well. I'm saying that because that being for space or being in space, that has very telos emphasis in it. And I think there's a big part is that, Daniel, what you're bringing up is the idea of the accidental qualities of things. And the only reason, but the thing is, this only is intelligible by having undistinction what form is. There's many different kinds of form. The whole point of a boat being a porch is because there's a schema. It's schema similarity. It happens to be a certain shape via schema that allows it to be used as a porch, for example. That is not its morphe, nor is that its eidos, and nor is it its paradigma. These are all different kinds of form. And actually, and that relates again, like why this idea of space or place is so important, because health has exactly the same quality. Health is this kind of, as I wrote an essay in Substack about this, it's this, health is it's always in a place for Aristotle and Plato. It's always in a place. And thus, it is the reason why it's almost this gateway to metaphysics is because to have any intelligibility about it, you have to have this larger complex understanding of form over the multiplicity of time. Meaning the embryo is not the same as the toddler, is not the same as the adult, as a human, but yet they're all human. They're all man. So what is up with this? Because if you look at these objects, they look nothing like each other in any way by their schema. By their schema, they have no relationship. They're radically other, let alone their activity functions. For example, and rationality, intelligence, things like that. You get that developed in time. The encantos, as I talk about in a health class. This is showing the stretching of what form is being drawn out to us. And I think the Deleuzian point of the smoothness created space as this ethical choice of how to organize our experience, as in being in space or for space, has this direct relationship with health and memory and cultivation and training and habituation. Because habituation generally, as diathesis, disposition, means our orientation. It means through orientation. So it's how we're oriented in space, carried through in memory and time. There's no to share. So again, I thank Chloe for the remembrance of Deleuze. I do appreciate that. I wanted to read more about this smoothness radiated space thing. It's really interesting. That's all I have.
That is very interesting, and I'm not familiar with that. And so thank you very much, Cleo. And again, hope you feel better. Goodness. Very interesting, just off the cuff on what you're saying there. And I appreciate this way that you are describing these different kinds of forms and the stretching of forms. And then for me, there is the line. So it is just very interesting how discernment or the meta judgment is the subject in relation to this concert of forms that they are then making an apprehension of. That is just very interesting, that this apprehension of the relation of these forms to make a certain judgment of, like you're saying, the boat could be a porch because of the schema, right? You don't even have, it's not like you calculate that. It's not like you quantify that. You go, oh, there you go, right? And so you're passing this very quickly. But of course, the quickedness of the apprehension may be a reason why we are susceptible to smoothness in a manner that actually impoverishes our capacity to apprehend and discern amidst these forms in a manner that is actually most fitted, and certainly are going to be in service of virtue and adaptability in the system. So I think that's a wonderful point. And it is very interesting, the difficulty, you can't really calculate if the boat should be a porch or not. You have to apprehend it, which makes me think of the Sam Green distinction from her story, The Mermaid. Very interesting on in space versus for space. Off the cuff, what it makes me think, there's a big difference between being used in service of space for space, which could perhaps, if we make a distinction between space-time and time-space, would be at the expense of time and the expense of unfolding, versus simply be in space, which is a manifestation of time that then you are just operating more consciously of, and that actually you are not bound to the space so much. But then again, I would be curious how Deleuze uses those terms. That is very, very interesting. I will stop and give it to Christian. Christian, thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you. You guys are all looking very dapper today. I like the beard, Mr. Jockin. Looking very Mr. Professor. I like the look. Good look. Yeah, and also I wanted to say thank you to everyone for, if ever needed, any patience over the last 3 months, as I've been very activated with my intellectual pursuits on this essay, which is finally done. I hope I didn't take up too much space in the conversation with my energy. But it's been very helpful to have you guys as a sounding board and interlocutors as I was exploring those ideas. Very appreciated. Yeah, you're bringing up something that's interesting to me, Daniel. I can't say I completely understand what you're getting at, but the idea of telos in what seems like our kind of how we apprehend the world, like how we say what is what. This is, if I'm understanding you correctly, it is very interesting because it's, I mean, it's almost, or is in some part, an ethical consideration. Because we ask ourselves, how should I regard the boat? Is it good to regard it as a porch right now or not? And then that all eventually has to reduce down to some type of consideration about the nature of what we shall do or should do. But there's not, in my opinion, there's not a final answer to the question. It's just kind of, you know, your telos, your orientation kind of guides you the best it can. It may shapeshift later as you run into life in new ways, as you become surprised. But I want to vouch for holding telos as a, maybe in some sense back to what Daniel was talking about, almost like a posture more than as a conception, something very embodied. I think about, I use the phrase like energetic posture a lot. It's kind of like, how am I holding myself? What is the relationship between the different parts of who I am, my intellect, my emotions, my physicality? Do I, you know, and then there's not a single necessarily like correct posture, like a military posture, or, you know, I don't even think that there's like, there's like a tricky thing where you might think that telos, your telos is a certain conception of your own posture. Like, this is the correct posture. I don't personally even buy into that. It's more about like, what is my posture in the moment in relation to my environment or to other people? In some cases, I'm going to find myself drawn to a more emotive place, a more intuitive kind of posture, heart-centered, you know, intuition centered. Other times I'm just very instinctual. Like when I'm on the soccer field, I'm not, I will not perform my best soccer game if I'm really busy, like analyzing soccer. That's why I always try to take a little bit of an edible an hour beforehand, because then my brain shuts the fuck up and I perform a lot better. But then, of course, in other situations, I'm much more intellectually oriented. But it's almost like, yeah, telos is a live thing. It is. If there's something that's consistent through time that I can call telos, it is just a kind of perhaps self-reflective movement where I am creating some space that allows for any necessary repositioning, reposturing that may need to come up. But there's a trade-off there, right? Like, a situation may call for a certain kind of posture and demand my attention such that there's less space for reposturing, and I have to, you know, kind of commit a little bit to a certain posture, and then maybe later I'll have time to reflect and be like, that was, you know, more or less appropriate than I think it should have been. And then in other situations, I can kind of maintain a little bit more meta awareness, etc. But you know, I think an interesting consideration there is your physical health. I think when I am more physically healthy, I have better affordance to more spaciousness around my situation. Whereas if I'm not so healthy, it's like I have less bandwidth there to play with. So it's just kind of a net positive to take care of physical health, I find. Otherwise, it's yeah, you know, you can get groggy, you can get languid, you can just get more stuck easily, or kind of energetically tight and stiff, and not have that flexibility that helps us move throughout our day and find the most appropriate posture for whatever situation we may be encountering.
No, very well put, and I'll give it to Michael. You said a lot there that is very, very important. There is something very interesting about telos that is a certain unity of, you could say, ontology and ethics. Like, why is it telos is a word that suggests an isness, that in that very isness suggests a right way for that thing to be is, or it suggests a way that that isness has a certain trajectory if it maintains the conditionality of that isness. Right? So there's a certain sort of trajectory that then comes from the idness. I would argue that it is meaningless to discuss telos without some sort of embodiment or some sort of efficient, like a making of a thing. Like telos and embodiment or thingness is always tied together, because that very embodiment, we could say, or that very materiality is the condition that is the condition of telos. Like, materiality is the condition of telos. So because, because this object meets the condition of having a certain shape, of being made with a certain intention, conditions are met by which then it is fitting for this object to float on the water, ergo a boat, right? But that comes from the embodiment of the thing, right? Like the embodiment, here's the key, you cannot add a telos to a thing without first making its embodiment, without first making its materiality. It's not like I can add telos to a vacuum. I have to make a thing like a boat, or I have to birth a human being, and now there can be a telos. But telos comes from the bottom up, per se. The problem I think that often occurs is we associate telos with final cause, and final cause is at the end of time, so it feels like it's timeless, outside of materiality, and therefore it feels top down. But of course, when Aristotle is talking about the four causes, they are all together in concert. The final cause is inseparable from the efficient cause. These things are inseparable. They go together, right? So absolutely, there is a proper connection between telos and a certain posture, which is given by the materiality or the embodiment of the entity in question. And in fact, the telos of a boat that suddenly gets a hole in the bottom could, just like that, change from one that doesn't have a hole in the bottom, right? It is now no longer fitting to use this boat to sail. Now it might be fitting to be a home, like in the Southern Beast, that wonderful meta-modern film or something, right? Like it suddenly can change, and it is not wrong to use a boat with a hole in it as a home on the side of on the beach because it has a hole in it, right? So the materiality, as I'll say simplistically, absolutely is from which the telos is emerged. Because another thing, if you say in a theological sense, the purpose of man is to worship God. Well, that is given to man because you have a mind, an intellect, emotions. That is because of what the human is, that they are thus capable of worship in the materiality of the human being, right? So those things go together. It sounds top down to say, the purpose of man is to worship God. It sounds like God is saying that and pressing it down upon the materiality of human beings, but actually it arises up with the materiality of human beings in their particularity, right? So I definitely think that there's been a lot of confusion on telos when it is separated from notions like the body or embodiment or conditionalism, as I like to say. I think that's led to a lot of confusion. I will also say there is an argument to be made of a certain unavoidability of teleological thinking. I'll just make that, and in terms of ethical considerations, actually. The famous justice lectures by Dr. Sandel at Harvard, he makes that wonderful example of golf, where there was a question of the guy, he said, because I have back problems, can I use a, what do you call those in golf cart? Golf cart. Wow, that wasn't a hard one. I couldn't remember. Golf cart. Can I use a golf cart to go to the holes? And a lot of people said, absolutely not. If you use a golf cart, it's no longer golf. Actually, the walking to the ball is essential to what golf is, actually. This went to the Supreme Court. It went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, nope, can't use, there you go, you can't use the golf cart. It was a teleological question of what is golf? What is essential to golf? And what's very interesting about, here's the key, because telos and categorization go together. Because the question is, if I use a golf cart to go to the ball, does the activity that I'm doing look like golf, but it's actually no longer golf? And therefore, what is fitting and fair changes, right? And so what ends up happening, and likewise, the distinction between, say, murder and killing, which there's all this idea of is morality, is ethics relative or not? Well, if something is actually murder, then it is objectively wrong. The question is the act of ending a life murder or killing? Say, stepping on a bug. Well, some people would say it's murder or not, right? So what category applies? The absoluteness of the ethical consideration, if that category applies, is absolute. but it is not given that that category applies. Maybe it's just killing versus murder. How do you tell? Well, you're going to get into you're going to get into isness. Is this a human being or not? Is life based on consciousness or not? So now you don't eat animals, right? It's going to, and you brought this up on the ethical with consciousness and why this is such a massive topic. It's ethics and isness are tied together. The opening paper of The Truism, the Rational is Truth Organizes Values. What values you determine to, what values apply, honesty, just, etc., so forth, is relative to what is the case. How do you determine what is the case, though? Crap, it's really hard. Dang it. You could argue the problem of the world today is we have a whole lot of ethical discourses without people struggling with the massive wrestling match of determining what is the case. You have people using the language of ethics without the training and work of discernment. And that is a recipe for a nightmare. We're basically trying to use ethics to determine the truth versus truth to organize ethics. And you get that backwards, you're doomed because everyone is in a different reality tunnel. Because whatever you say is ethical necessarily says what is. And then if you're getting everyone into your ethics, you're getting them into like an alternative reality. That's why everyone is in their own reality tunnels, because people are going from ethics to truth per se, or isness, versus isness to ethics. Because ethics to isness is pretty easy. You just get angry. But isness to ethics, that's really hard. And the argument would be that teleological considerations are unavoidable once you realize that isness and ethics are inseparable. The question is simply, what is the character and quality of this teleology? And I think tying it to embodiment, tying it to the conditionality of materiality is central, because that also allows the possibility of flexible teleology. Like, again, a boat can get a hole in it, and therefore it can have a different fitting end. So it's not totalitarian bound to a certain end because its materiality can change. So there's a certain flexibility that is there, right? Now, of course, if the boat maker made it to be a boat and it gets a hole in it, that's unfortunate. We would say it's bad, given the telos that was invented for it. But that doesn't mean we have to necessarily throw the boat away. We could look at its materiality and come up with something else to use it for, even if it is not intended. So sure, it's not great that the boat got a hole in it. The boat maker doesn't make boats to get holes in the boat, but once it does, there can be a flexibility of how the boat is used, because the boat is not determined to be thrown away or burned as soon as it gets a hole in it. See, this is, I think, the problem. People speak about teleological as if you get out of line with the theology, you're dead. You got to be burned. You got to be thrown away. No, no, no. That is why I think people are so resistant to teleological thinking, because they think that once a thing is not aligned with its theology, it's valueless. It's worthless. It is to be disposed. No, it now just has to be reconsidered. It's unfortunate that it is out of line with its theology, because the boat maker doesn't make a boat to put a hole in it. But now that it has occurred, it invites creative possibility. And maybe in that creative possibility, something can be thought that redeems, per se, or elevates it into a different causation. That is not cut off from us. Once you understand that teleology does not limit creativity or possibility, it can be worked in concert with a certain flexibility based on the discernment of the materiality of the phenomenon that has been changed by conditionality. Well, then it stops being so oppressive. It's only oppressive if you can't think creatively. So it becomes important to think creatively. But let me give it to Michael here. Michael.
Yeah, it's been a joy to be here and to listen. It's funny, Daniel. I was literally going to bring up golf before you mentioned that, and so now they're coming together in an interesting way. I played golf competitively as a kid. I had my first plastic club in my hand when I was like 2 years old, and I was chasing plastic balls around the backyard, and ended up playing at an international level when I was like 12, 13. And the sport of golf for me is I mean, it's interesting and unique in so many ways, but I think the most unique part of it, and now just thinking about it in the context of this conversation, is that there's no other sport that I've come across where you have as the amount of time between the actual performance of the thing is greater than I think any other sport. And like what what almost every professional golfer says is that, like, the sport is like 95% mental. Um, because there's all of this time spent between hitting of one shot and the next shot when all sorts of thoughts can flood into your head. I mean, I would literally have, if I was playing at a course that I had played before for like a week before the tournament, I would have like nightmares about like, all right, I'm standing on the first tee shot and I just shanked the ball into the street, or like I hit a tree or something. And unfortunately, when I was 12, 13, I didn't have the psychotechnologies and role models to help me move through that. And I kind of hit a plateau at a certain point, I think because of that. It's easy to point to like certain physical characteristics and like innate talent and things, but the people that I've observed from junior golf to the pros who actually make it are the people who are able to quiet their mind. But I think it's interesting because there's like immediately when you hit the shot and you walk to the next one, there is a lot of planning and like kind of analysis that's required. Like I literally had like this 13-step like pre-shot checklist that my dad like taped on the shafts of my clubs, like the wind direction, the temperature, the lie, the all of these things that you like have to consider. And so you simultaneously have to be in this like more intellectual, like kind of removed from like the act of the thing. But then once you like go up to hit the shot, like all of that has to go away. And you just have to like trust. You have to trust in the embodiment of the thing. You have to be like totally present and committed. And if you're not committed, even if you're like 99% committed, but you have 1% of doubt, like it won't go well. And so I think it's really interesting to think about like how we can be in like a mode of, like Christian was talking about, like on the soccer field, where it's like the kind of left hemisphere brain is very quiet. But also like not lose that completely, because if you lose that completely, then you're just, you're like running around chasing the soccer ball, but you're like not really taking your like surroundings into account and actually thinking like, should I go for that slide tackle or should I not? And so there's like a sense of, there's a sense in which like flow, it's not like flow is like the absence of thinking. It's like, I don't know how to exactly frame it or think about it, like the right proportion of thinking versus embodiment, but like, Ian McGilchrist talked about like the master and his emissary, like the thinking is like the emissary for the master, which is I don't know, the embodied intuitive movement or something like that. And the last thing before I pass it back, I've been thinking a lot about telos and, with respect to religion and, like I'm just encountering with my faith, like certain like views on things that it seems like to subscribe to a Christian way of life, you have to adopt. Like the other day, my aunt, bless her heart, she was like, if I ever get the phone call that you're dating someone who's not a Christian, like I don't ever want to get that phone call. And I'm like, I don't know what my views are on that yet. But like, if my view is, I tend to feel, if I feel into my body, that my view is that that's not correct. But like, what am I risking if I have that view in relationship with my aunt? Like, am I like, I don't, she's always said like, oh, we'll love you regardless of, what your faith is. But it's kind of that feeling of like loved as like unyoked brethren kind of feeling that a lot of Christians have, where they're like, we we believe that everyone is like the sons and daughters of Christ, but if you don't actually accept Jesus into your life, there's like a distance there. And I just heard this quote today. Apparently, it was given by a Hindu Swami, where he says the truth is one, but the paths are many, something like that. And kind of the idea that like the Baha'i faith, for example, has, where like there's kind of this universal like cosmic truth, and all the different traditions in the world like have a different way of getting there, kind of like a Unitarian kind of view. And the more and more like Christians, or like I think the other Abrahamic religions too, doesn't seem like they buy into that. Like they are very much like, our tradition is the way. It is the one way to heaven or to relationship with God. And I'm like really struggling with like, how do I hold that the tradition that I'm attempting to subscribe to is like the way, and not just fall into like moral relativism, but also I don't want to like have the I don't want to have the sentiment. I don't want anyone to get the vibe of me that like if they're not subscribed to Christianity, that they're somehow like they're like not there yet, like what you were saying with the boat example of like their telos is like not right or proper, or they're damned. Yeah. I think there's very real, like kind of on a more like psychological level, if you encounter, say someone who's like suicidal or like very deeply in depression, like that is clearly someone who has lost connection, or has maybe never had connection to like their true essence. And I think like there's a lot of work that can be done without falling into kind of like moral judgmentation, to like facilitate growth and opening and like deep connection. But then when you get into things like faith, it's really complicated. Anyways, I'll pass it back. But I've been listening to this podcast on Martin Luther, by the Rest is History folks, and Tom Holland makes a really interesting argument that the default nihilistic secular society that we have now is actually a product of the Protestant Reformation. Because what Luther did during the Protestant Reformation is he said, all of these idols, all of these like saints, all of these other people other than God that the now Catholic Church is worshiping, like that is distracting us from like a true, like just pure belief in God. And he had this very like revolutionary spirit. And what Tom Holland says is like, if you take that view to an extreme, you risk banishing God altogether. And I think I don't want to be the type of religious person that is kind of just like the kind of like godless, spiritless Protestantism that so much of the world falls into, which I think comes from a place of like a worry of like alienating yourself or alienating other people with your faith. So anyways, I'm starting to ramble, so I'm going to pass it back.
Not at all. And first off, yes, the ethical real problem of internally consistent systems. If you're in this tribe, you're good to go. This is the problem of pluralism. That is, if not thought, we're trapped in vectors of the good, and we need the beautiful, or we're dead. So this is a major issue. And what you're also talking about, various theologies, notions of faith. Certainly there is a thesis that modernity reflects the Protestant Reformation. It is very interesting to look at the Protestant Reformation as reformations with an S, because you have Zwingli, you have Luther, you have different people with different ideas. In a very odd way, if we see secularism following from more of a Calvinistic direction, then in this notion of tulip, that creates a certain split between the holy and the non-holy, which can actually invite a hard distinction between, say, faith and society, which then actually, because it is actually not practically possible for people to live in two domains as if they don't influence one another, the very effort for people to try, say, for the idea of the separation of church and state, if you take that to mean you shouldn't bring faith into politics, that's literally impossible. If people try, they become confused and eventually they say, screw it, and usually they will give up on the religion, and then you could possibly end up in the nihilism because of the psychological anxiety that trying to keep those worlds apart results in. Eventually, those mental gymnastics are too difficult, and that just leads to a certain giving up, and the food is never digested. But it is very interesting to actually compare, and I know Joel Carini has been doing this work. I do like Zwingli, in comparing all of the different thoughts that came out of the Protestant Reformation and how things could have been different. Of course, the Protestants did not think they were making a separate church at the time. They thought they were reforming the Catholic Church, and then one knows how this goes. I should also note that it's also important that many of the teleological considerations, if we say that, man is made to worship God, and that's the telos. What's very interesting is actually there's plenty of room for interpretation there. Like telos, like another problem that happens is people think about telos as this very kind of restricting thing. Like, ships are used to sail. Okay, there's infinite ways to sail a ship. There's infinite places to sail to. There's infinite bodies of water. There are infinite things you can add to the ship. There's plenty of room for individuation to occur in that. Likewise, what does it mean to worship? Lots of space for interpretation. Another way to think about this, without telos, you have no range to bind interpretation. Like telos is the binding of interpretation so that you avoid madness, infinite deferral, right? Like you say, okay, this is the materiality boat. I'll just keep using that example. Given this materiality, please offer various interpretations of how this thing could be used, given the materiality. So the interpretation is bound by the materiality, and you are basically taking, you could say, guesses at what would be the most fitting thing to use it based on the materiality, and you are binding, and what you are interpreting is something embodied. And so there's the possibility of conversation because we're in a relative range, right? So the other thing that ends up happening without teleological consideration is you're actually still going to be operating according to telos without knowing it, judging what ought to be the case based on is, so then you could perhaps be susceptible to capture or impoverishment of discernment. But then also, if not that, you have a certain ever pulling apart that can occur. So we also have to see the teleological as a range of possibility conditioned by the materiality or embodiment of the thing in question. So the binding is the materiality, but the materiality does not force you to interpret it or use it in a certain way, but it does bind you from infinite possibility. And that negotiation can be thought of as a range of materiality. Also, I would just note, I love what you were saying about the golfer. I always think about how in wrestling, the best wrestlers, were able to get 5 or 6 moves they could do without thinking about it. They were able to just forget and make it happen. I would argue that sports is supposed to be the art of the movement between what I call thinking and perceiving, where you think, and then you're able to stop and move into just perception or kinetic, into, the use of the body. You're able to let it all go, as you said. Yes, that's it. Absolutely. I think athletics and Hegelian thought go together there. There's a certain negation. You let it go. The letting, as Thomas Wynne would also say, right? Truly great wrestlers who won state all the time, they were able to just not think about it, precisely because they had thought a lot about it. I do wonder, to say something provocative, I do wonder how much of the interreligious drama emerges because people aren't able to let it go, per se. There's a way in which you're supposed to say, let's take the example of Christianity. You study Christianity precisely to be able to let it go when you encounter your neighbor. To actually let it go in the encounter of the other person, right? If you're still thinking about oh my gosh, you're dating someone who's not a Christian, there's a certain way where you're not able to let it go. And therefore you're never able to actually kind of move into the excellence of the practice of the faith, right? The wrestler moves into the excellence of being a wrestler, right? There's an inability of knowing when it is proper to think these things versus not. right? When to let it go or not. Now, the details of that have to be brought out. So much of the concern is tied to particular doctrines of hell, damnation, sin, etc., so forth, that have to be explored. But I do think there perhaps is a bit of a lack of athletic metaphor in thinking when it comes to theology. That can perhaps be quite useful. But I will stop and I will give it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Hello.
Are you on a plane? That sounded like a plane took off. What the heck?
Yeah. No, you're good. Yeah, I'm in a car right now. But okay, so Michael said something really interesting because I felt like he was trying to get across this idea of I couldn't help but hear, something that I should be, right? Like if I go into Christianity, then I should be in a certain way. I should be. There's a shouldness in that kind of mapping. There's a kind of shouldness. If I follow this, then I should. It's really interesting. Oh man, I'm forgetting the guy's name. He wrote "God Still Matters." Forgot the guy's name. Anyways, Herbert McCabe. There it is. I always like referring to this because Herbert McCabe always says, and I think this is interesting in the dialogue of religious mappings or just any mappings in general, is that we never think about where we to begin where we are, essentially. There's something really damning, I think, about if you decide to pick a map, then it's like, well, then you should be this way. I don't think that, the transition doesn't work like that, the transition never works like that. Even when you start praying, like prayer is actually a very great example, and McCabe always gives this example of like, okay, now you believe in God, pray, right? Immediately you go, well, how should I pray? And then you start thinking, well, I'll pray like the saints pray, or I'll pray like the way a good person should pray. And that's just like, you just start getting into like some really weird traps there, because what ends up happening is you fall into the Lacanian empty speech kind of thing, where now you're falling into like the gutter of what one should say in prayer versus the negativity of prayer of, what should I say? What should I ask for? Actually, McCabe's answer is very interesting. When you enter this spiritual journey, you're a child. Pray like a child. Right? Pray like a child. You will mature into the map. And I think that's something that's been kind of missed about mapping. There is no, if we're going to talk about digestion, there is no rhetoric of maturing into the mapping. There's either you are or you aren't. And this is something that I feel like, definitely should be grappled with, because the philosophy or around conversion is very interesting. Because what makes someone most prone to become a fundamentalist, I would say, is that all of a sudden they think to themselves, well, I must drop everything. I must drop who I am. I must be what I should be now. It's just fascinating. There's no digestion in that. There's just, I have thrown away the past. I have thrown away my discrepancies. I have thrown away what I find discomfort in these maps. There is no real tango going on with what's happening. And I think even going back to something that Christian was, Michael was saying about golf, he didn't know what to call it. I would say in acting, that's called preparation. You're preparing for the shot. And then once you prepare, what's ironic about acting, once you prepare, you have to let go. Right? There's no fixation on getting the script right. It's all done in the preparing, and whatever comes out is what comes out. But there's a kind of looseness to that, and I've always enjoyed this metaphor that Sanford Meisner gives of The script is the boat. Our affect, our pathos, is the turbulence that drives the boat. So I've always thought that was very interesting about telos, because if the concern is about telos, it feels like telos is the script, telos is the boat. But notice how actually it's our relation to that telos, our freedom of the pathos, that drives that boat that actually matters, right? So when we say that we have a lacking telos, a telos that lacks, it's going to be how we relate to this lack that matters more than the telos itself, per se. How we drive this boat. How turbulent is it? Is it smooth? All these other questions that we can ask and what that means. But yeah, it's very important that we kind of would see it in this light, that, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't ask when they talk about maps. When they talk about this symbolic other, it's that one missing Lacanian question, right? It's always, what does the other want? We never ask, what do I want, right? What do I want is not the end goal, of course, but to ask that question is to begin to relate to the map in a way that now we can move on, and then also we can relate to identify the lack. So, and I think that's very important, because obviously, and I could hear it, Michael, I don't want to point you out here, but I could hear it in the rhetoric, right, of what does the other want from me, and that's what's causing me anxiety. But it also must be posed, what do you want? And in there, between the tension of those two questions, we see that the map is incomplete, and somehow we find our answer along that tension. I can't give you what that answer is for you, but it's in there. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
I appreciate very much what you're saying. The telos, based on the idness of, say, being a Christian, sets the range of the tension between what they want and what you want, thus making there be difference, but it is intelligible. And the development, the work is struggling with that. I think the point that you just rose, how the telos is in a sense what you struggle with and in. Like if you don't have a telos, there's no struggle. It's very interesting. Like there's not really negativity. The telos creates because in a way, virtue is earned through the struggle of a telos. Like if you go, okay, man is to worship God. What does that mean? I have no idea. All right. Well, you have to struggle to figure that out. And you wouldn't struggle to figure that out without some sort of telos, right? You may, ultimately what ends up happening, here's the problem. I mean, everyone has a telos. Capitalism, getting a job, making the number go up, right? One of the problems is the removal of telos. Doesn't mean there is no telos. It means you don't pick your telos, and you will still struggle. You still struggle with some sort of telos. It's just not going to be for your development. It will be for something external from you. It'll be the system, because of course, capitalism is your posture. You're in a capitalist model. You're embodied. You have to have housing. It's all tied to paying the bills. Like all of this orients you to carrying out actions in favor of the system. And that doesn't mean the system is quote unquote necessarily bad. But the issue that ends up occurring is that telos and struggle are strongly tied together. And there are many people who go to work 9 to 5 and struggle, and they don't like their job. And because there is this interesting idea of one of the ways you kind of talk is like, well, if you work really hard to pay your bills and to take care of your family, there's an idea that that's virtuous, right? That creates virtue, which is interesting, because in that there's a notion of doing something you don't want to do that actually is virtuous because you don't want to do it, and that it forces a certain struggle of you, right? So struggle and virtue go together. The issue becomes, though, if you only have one source of struggle that then may develop you in your capacity to be on time or to do what you're told, or maybe to fix cars, but you're limited in a gutter, of the way you develop according to struggle. You don't have a diversity of ways to develop according to struggle. And when you lose teleological thinking or adding possible teleologies of what you could do, then you're likely to only develop according to the way to struggle given to you by the cultural or economic context, which may ultimately just be in service of the metaphysic of that system, which may be autonomous rationality or quantification at the expense of quality, right? So it is very interesting to think that struggle and telos go together. And ultimately, what I would just say is that telos is a kind of conversation. It's a kind of negotiation and working with and gives and takes relative to what you think it means to worship, or what it means to say be rational or to be loving. Or if you say, well, the telos of human beings is to love one another. Okay, how do you do that? Be nice to people. Well, there are times where being nice is enabling, right? Or you say, well, do unto others what you don't want for yourself. Well, George Shaw said, well, what if they don't like what you like? And you just do to them what you like? Well, they don't like that, right? So figuring out what it means to love one another actually requires difficulty. And there will be struggle, because you'll probably express love to someone and they won't like it. And then you'll get upset because you were just trying to help them. And then you're tempted by bitterness and you actually have to resist that. So it is, I think, proper to think of the telos as setting up this thing that you struggle with and in, and that virtue is reflective of that very struggle. I also very much appreciate on what you were saying, maturing to the map. I think that's getting at a lot. The girdle point is big here on all of this for me, because the encounter of the girdle point, like there's a way in which the telos of maps is the encounter of the girdle point. Like that is the point of map. That's the argument I am liking to make, is that we have used maps to avoid the point of incompleteness. I would like to say that the point of maps is to find a point of incompleteness that is intelligible to you and that can be opened in a manner that you can handle without you being overwhelmed. Like the telos of things is to find where they are incomplete, per se. That's a very different notion of telos. That is, the telos is the point of their completion. Well, in notion of internally consistent systems, the telos of an internally consistent system is to complete them precisely in the point where it shows that the map is not the territory. The point of a map is to experience it's not the territory. Well, how do you do that? You have to finish the map. That's really hard. Yes. And then you feel like you wasted all your time because it's a negation in a kind of Hegelian sense, right? That sort of telos is an opening, and it's a struggle to do. There is more to say. I will pause. I will give it to Christian and then Mr. Jockin. Christian.
Yeah, we all but said this in our conversation some weeks ago, Daniel, but I want to invoke the concept of the mapless map in the kind of Zen Buddhist sense of the gateless gate. That well, it's so experientially, it's so interesting when you pass through the gateless gate, where there seems, on the one hand, you can like create this distinction between before and after, but then the after kind of negates before and afterness, and then you're like, you have to let it go in some sense, which is an interesting, it's an interesting kind of tension to hold. But I think it's helpful to just reflect that there is this kind of paradoxical concept of a gateless gate, which you recognize, and yet which almost like dissolves itself. Like, what is that? What is a gateless gate? Like, I can't kind of make sense of that I can't draw you what the gateless gate looks like. But when you pass through it and then you notice it disappearing behind you, it's like, well, that I recognize that there's something to this paradoxical notion. And I think it's interesting to see the value in holding of paradox. That in itself maybe is kind of a girdle point, or a girdle token, perhaps, where you have a concept which is in some sense like apophatic in nature, and it's a useful concept. You don't just discard it, and yet you don't want to get stuck in it, blah blah blah. There's an interesting phraseology from Hindu tradition. It's you use the golden thorn to remove the thorn, but then you must throw both thorns away in some sense. And you don't stop recognizing that there is a golden thorn. It's still a valid concept, and yet you also don't want to replace the thorn with the golden thorn. I don't know how much this makes sense. It's very abstract stuff, but maybe you're following. With Christianity, I always, maybe this is a cope, but I always thought that one of the kind of girdle clues was in Romans, with Paul talking about how the law is inscribed on the Gentiles' heart, right? It's an interesting concept, and I something I never thought about before you brought it up was, Daniel, was this concept of Paul's work being like a third testament, which that makes sense to me in certain ways. I don't agree with everything Paul says, but maybe that's kind of the point. Is like, this is a guy who was like kind of moving past what I call like the adolescence of Christianity, and saying like, we have to keep marching toward the horizon of our map. It's not, the map is not contained in the sawdust of the book of the scriptures. It's an open-ended evolutionary process, but a lot of people don't like that. It can be very uncomfortable. Maybe that's because we're not fluent in map making, and so we need a kind of prescriptive map that's got all the answers and blah blah blah, and never mind the fact that I'm always just interpreting that map anyways and really creating my own bespoke map. I like to believe that there is an objective singular map, and it has all the territory in it that I need. Never mind questions about AI or all the things that the Bible doesn't address that we have to confront. I still want the goddamn map. Anyway, but we find the same thing in all politics and traditions and belief systems, is this desire for some kind of certainty. I want to plug this amazing show, and I believe the whole series is on YouTube. It's called Connections, and the host is this guy, James Burke. It was an old BBC show, I want to say late 70s, maybe very early 80s. And I won't spoil the season finale, but every episode looks at the history of a particular invention. And the final episode looks at how all of those inventions were needed for X invention. And this is, to me, a great demonstration of creativity. It's like, like this guy invented the atomizer for the sake of perfume. And so this kind of creative repurposing of things, we're not using the atomizer the way it should be used. If you kind of anchor it to this one historical moment, no, it can be this totally other. It can serve this other purpose, which is really interesting. And that's so much of what creativity is, and that's so much of what evolution is. And of course, we can approach ourselves in the same way, where we refuse to kind of fixate or fix ourselves as a certain object or personality or persona, whatever, and rather allow ourselves to continue evolving, because we recognize that we can always reinterpret ourselves. And maybe that has a lot to do with the kind of map context we put ourselves in. I've been thinking about how all this relates to a different kind of New Agey fundamentalism with like the Gaia hypothesis. A good friend of mine, Bobby Azarian, he takes a very um, big mind evolution of like the consciousness of the cosmos type of perspective as a way to kind of balance out what is his physicalist leaning. And I kind of shy away from that teleology of, well, our purpose is to create this bigger consciousness of the cosmos. Because to me, that this is too, we're fixing ourselves too much, and also, you know, we're also kind of destining ourselves for subsumation into something that, you know, well, I don't know why we should assume it. Like we this kind of notion of like the kingdom of God is more like the kingdom of Gaia, and we must you know, work towards our consciousness getting subsumed into some great Gaian consciousness. It's like, well, are we sure? Is like, you know, do all the animals need to follow suit, and what does that mean? And what it sets us up for is then, you know, the Catholic Gaian church, where we need a priest class now to tell us whether we're moving toward or away from this teleology of creating the great conscious cosmos or whatever, and it will just devolve into the same types of tribalism and political divisions that we'll find in typical religions. I have a note here about Sun Ra, famous jazz musician, who said that a good musician forgets everything they know. To many of the points already being made, I feel like you have to know something before you can forget it, right? This is what we're kind of talking about with sports and preparation. Mastery kind of requires a lot of learning and then a lot of forgetting, which is, you know, a lot of times people pick one or the other. It's like trying to jump straight into a flow state and just, you know, operate off of pure intuition and never build up skillfulness. And then there's people who get stuck in the skillfulness and never learn to forget and kind of enter the flow state. But there's, yeah, I think it's already been said well by everyone else, that kind of art of sport and embodiment and learning and forgetting and flow and mastery. Another thing, I forget what was said that brought this up, but I have a note here about something that's always stuck with me from Jung's Red Book, which is when he speaks on the difference between imitating Christ and emulating Christ. And I thought about this a little bit more the other day as I was driving back home from Phoenix, and there was a big something on the side of the road with the phrase, "Jesus is the answer." And I was in a contemplative mood, and so I was contemplating Jesus, and that imitation versus emulation thing came to mind. And another thing that I've brought up before, which is like the transcendence of the concept of my life, which is a big thing I've been spending a lot of time with. It's like a personal thing that I feel like is a big horizon for me, is to let go of the reality tunnel, which I call like my life. You know, some personal telos of I want to achieve this, I want to accomplish that, or I failed there, blah, blah, blah. And kind of reshaping that reality tunnel to be more of, you know, a bit non-dual, you might say, a bit more unified with reality itself. There's just this life with a capital L, and a Christian way of saying it might be, you know, you hate the world and gain eternal life, right? We can interpret that in different ways. What does it mean to hate the world? I would be interested in looking at the kind of literal translations there. But the way I've always taken it is, it's not like you're hating reality per se. You're hating the map. And hate's a strong word, which is why I'd be interested in looking at the literal translations. But I think that the point there is like you don't get stuck in the map. and in letting it go, you gain the eternal life with a capital L. You get what is more real than the map of reality. And anyways, in terms of emulation versus imitation, I think Jesus is a good example of someone who did not have a life, like, right? He didn't have a life in the sense of like, where am I? What's my retirement plan? He wasn't like, I want to be the best carpenter in the world or whatever. He was like, kind of what's my fate? What's my situation? What's the hand that I've been dealt? And what's the best way to play that hand, or the right way to play that hand? And I think if we're going to hold Christ there as an exemplar in some sense, it's to emulate that kind of posture of what's the hand I've been dealt and what's the best way to play it, rather than what hand was Jesus dealt and can I play that hand? It's like, no. It's about playing the hand that you're dealt, rather than trying to play someone else's hand or hoping for a certain hand, right? It doesn't help you much in poker to be like, I'm going to win with a royal flush today or a full house, right? No, you're going to get the hand that you're dealt. And it might be a bunch of 2s and 3s, whatever. The point is to play it the best you can. And at that point, you're not even really concerned about winning, so to speak. You're being a good sportsman. You're motivated by the art of the sport rather than the glory of winning. And lastly, my note is maybe kind of just the same stuff: rebirth versus conversion. This is what Hobbes talked about. And, my most profound moments that seem the most religious, I think about them more as rebirth moments more than as conversion moments. I don't feel like, I got converted to a new ideology. I feel more like, I was reborn. I became a new person in a very deep, deep way. It probably won't be the last time that I'll have a rebirth, right? But this is... Yeah, I mean, if you look closely at Christianity, this is very much what's supposed to be happening, right? You're supposed to be having a kind of spiritual rebirth. I believe that's, was probably a lot of what was happening with baptism, was a very deep, embodied, energetic, metaphysical rebirth, not just a kind of symbolic conversion. And it's in rebirth that the digestion happens, right? Because as has been said, you're not necessarily doing any digesting if you're merely converting. In fact, the conversion can just be a kind of a papering over, or even like a tampening down of the undigested parts of your psyche. It's like, I don't like this part of myself. I was a sinner, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to kind of symbolically convert to something that's very shiny and symbolizes the good, rather than doing the good thing of actually digesting my stuff and becoming new, right? If there's a conversion, it's like a metabolic conversion, you might say. And anything else you might kind of generally call spiritual bypass of some form or another. There you go.
Magnificent. And I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, and then I'll have to go here in a minute to put out chairs. I have 2 tours, and wedding season is something, but I very much appreciate everything you were saying. I definitely think self-forget. I like also with Clayton. Clayton, good to have you, sir, on the idea of becoming the spirit of the map. There is a big difference between becoming so skilled in your map that you can have a certain auto mastery, a certain self-forgetfulness in the map, but you're using a map not to defend the map, which is indestructible, which is what a lot of people do, but actually to gain a certain auto mastery that makes you able to handle the girdle point, that makes you handle the incompletion. And you actually need a map to get that training that you can then enter a state of self-forgetfulness to then handle the girdle point. But in a funny way, we could say that the entire work of map making is basically stage one, the pregame almost, and then stage two, the real game, is handling the girdle point. And yet we have, as in all of history, been confusing the pregame as the game, in a sense. And at this moment of history is, I think, fitting to think this. I would also say that if we do not use automastery in this way, actually what's happening with the ethical discourse, the with Kirk, or the political discourse, is to actually make you in a certain self-forgetfulness based on anger. You lose yourself, you lose control. And what you're saying is, if you don't actually learn to master self-forgetfulness and automastery, you're still going to actually lose control. It will just be in service of someone's agenda, someone's discourse, or the language that gets controlled, that gets a life of its own, right? And that you're not able to escape. You're just kind of pulled along. So I think that's, you could argue that virtue is the work of making sure that you have auto mastery versus losing control, actually, to make sure a state of self-forgetfulness is toward the beautiful as opposed to the capture of some agenda. I think also I very much like what you were saying about my life and a certain removing of the necessity of the outcome. For me, as we are speaking, I think absolutely, and Jockin and I have had this conversation, where the teleological has to be bound up with the suchness of particular moments, like in the everyday moment of the encounter, in the particular suchness, like, and when you think of tele, like, so for example, if I encounter a cat, a barn cat, that is missing a leg, I'm not going to say, well, this isn't a cat, because a cat is that which has 4 legs. I'm going to go, oh, maybe I can actually help it get a robotic leg or make it a 4th leg, because a cat is that which hunts mice, it is that which is mobile, and it is lacking something that would enable it to actually do that thing. Therefore, I ought to help it gain mobility. So suchness, the suchness of this particular cat, can be a revelation of something the cat is lacking that is inhibiting the unfolding of it in its isness according to its own want of what in its own energy, right? But that sort of discernment of that possibility is only in suchness relative to lack, that is in conversation with the telos, that may not apply to any other cat on planet Earth. And that, I think, also, when I look at the yard and you're trying to plant grass seed, you're thinking, oh, it's lacking grass. The grass is dead. I ought to plant grass here, because a yard is that of which I want, it's great when children can run around barefoot and not step on rocks, right? But this idea of what I ought to do based on what this yard is for is not is based on the suchness experience of the yard, and it is not necessarily setting out a 50-year plan that I have to align with, or I'm an immoral person, right? So I think also, and this is David Hume's whole idea, we have based ethics, and thus the teleological, on a category of isness, which can be totalitarian, what a cat is, versus the particular experience of suchness of that particular cat at the barn, that can be a revelation of what this cat is lacking, that therefore what I ought to be able to do, right? And so there is a binding of the problem of teleology leading to dominance in suchness. And that's also something the Kyoto school says. I have more notes, but I will pass it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot was said. By the way, so I was reading through that commentary on Deleuze, and Daniel, you're going to love it. So it's right up your it's up your alley. It's exactly on the difference of the algorithmic versus the eupidic, the operation of striated space is kind of what you would think it is, which is division, basically division, measure counting by measure as in count, right, and sequence, versus the smooth, which is of holes, gestalts, things like geometry, apprehensions. So I think it's interesting that Deleuze is connecting this to a choice. And now I'm going to tie that to your note about lack as nothing. Is lack nothing? It is under a striated account. It is true. It is nothing. But under a smooth account, on the way which Deleuze is apparently talking about it, it's a present absence. And I say that because it's actually based on, it is true that that boat, for example, example. Keep using the boat. I feel like the next session entirely going to be boats, on boats, something like that. It is true that the activity of the boat, its reality as a boat, to do its function, that kind of fixedness of stance of teal, and a shift towards basically some other mode of form, not its definition, but it's something else. I say this because Aristotle makes a very, it's really interesting, right? So in Aristotle, he gets attributed this idea of definition of man as the animal with logos, right? Rational animal with, it has logos. He never really says that actually, right? But what he does say, it haunts my mind when I think about this. He does say what the archetype of man is, the principle. It's not logos. He gives us three. He doesn't give us, first of all, it's already very telling. He doesn't give us, if you notice, whenever Aristotle gives us a range of expression, he's trying to posit something. He's giving you a range to think about. He wants you to think through the terms or the positing. He doesn't want you to just give you it and then you fix into it. An example of that would be, in this case of the principle of man, it's the desirable nous, proiasis, deliberation, and the delectable use of nous. It's very interesting. And this language Aristotle's using is just so interesting. The other time you see him do a move like this is actually describing what anageia is. He doesn't give you a definition. He just gives you it's between this and this, this and this. Eyes closed, eyes awake. The building of the house, the builder with the knowledge of the house, the et cetera, et cetera. The statue of the Hermes, the material in the Hermes. And by the way, Daniel, from our discussion of partial objects, what is hysteresis lack? That is exactly what we're talking about. The sphere didn't come from the bronze as matter, it came from the lack, because lack is one of the principles of nature of coming to be. That's actually one of the key aspects. Actually, by the way, I know of creativity is that it's called function fixedness in literature. So when you look at an object and only see it for one account, because accounts, your logos of it tells reveal a telos. Every account has a telos attached to it. So by having a fixity of telos, you have a fixity of accounts, and that fixity of accounts means you cannot see in other possibilities. Thus, this idea of a present absence, aka it's lacking, but it has a certain possibility, it could be something else. I think it also attaches a digestion. So to digest is to take into oneself, to assume, take into oneself. So when it gets regurgitated, it's not language of regurgitation. When you're just regurgitating the information, you're just basically just a vehicle of memes, a vehicle of mimetic imagery, right? Of the mimetic space of information. If I'm just regurgitating, he's noticed that I'm presenting you. Isn't that interesting? Like I'm able to cite Aristotle and all these other points, but not just to regurgitate for the sake of regurgitating it. It's just said, I'm trying to draw out some insights for us together. So I think I noted digestion with integration and regurgitation. It's kind of interesting, that language there. I think that also attaches to the athletic activity, because I think Javier's point of preparation is exactly it. I trained as a boxer. I was an amateur boxer. So I will tell you, if you're actually the key, and that's a competitive, so as opposed to golf, which is, you're kind of isolated, you're kind of competing abstractly with others and with yourself, basically, like in the activity. Boxing, you are competing, you're in the contest with a direct other. But obviously, every professional does say, every higher level athlete does say it's a mental game, right? That's certainly true, but they give particularity to boxing. There's two. Actually, the key to victory is to get the other person in their own head. The automaticity of training allows you to act in a very automatic way that doesn't drain energy, achieves the result in a fluent, effective manner. But what you do is always strike against the opponent's ability so that they have to think. They have to think on your terms, respond to you, and more importantly, shut down some key fundamental thing that stops you from acting. So actually a good common example is breath. So a great boxer, what they'll do is they'll do body shots, punches to the lower, to the chest, to the abdomen, the solar plexus. These are meant to draw the breath out of someone so that you're actually shutting down their range of possibility of what they can do. You're actually intentionally setting up you're narrowing the space of the contest and narrowing the possibility space of your opponent to act in the way that you want them to act and usually requires them and then thinking in the manner you want them to think about. And then you set up traps, and this is the high level boxing stuff that happens. But it is related to this automaticity of thought. You have to have a certain level. It's very interesting. You're not thinking about how to throw a punch. You're not worried about that. You're worried about how to set my opponent to go into a certain position, to be in this corner, to be thinking about this attack's going to happen at this time in this place. But actually, I do the counter instead, where they thought they were preparing for the A attack, where they actually got Y attack instead. And then you knock them out because they weren't prepared for the attack. I think that also so I say this because remember, this is a definition and principle. What is the essence of boxing? What is its not its definition? Its essence. Its principle: to hit and not be hit. How that can be done in many different ways, in many possibilities. You see the difference? I'm just drawing this out in terms of like Aristotle's note of what a human. If a human is just simply the animal logos, but wait a minute, if you don't have logos, then you're not human. But that causes all these problems. But if we're the desirable nous, or proiesis, it's a liberation, meaning we're only human. Our essence is an activity with others in discourse in the proiesis. I mean, that's already very fascinating right there. And then the delectable use of nous, amazing. That's a little loose paraphrasing, so I don't have the Jack Randall on me, but I'm calling from memory on that. But that's still, again, very fascinating. That would be the essence of what man is. And notice what its object is being derived from is nous, not logos. Anyway, that's an agenda on my part on that. I'll leave that alone. I think this idea of, again, I bring this up as lack and absence and nothing aspect because of the telos and activity. The idea of the response to the contingent. See, that's the key. In the athletic contest, and it's actually a very key element of a mature boxer or any athlete, is you have to compete. Up, you got a sprained ankle. Up, you got a sprained shoulder. Up, this happened. Up, this happened. No excuses. You find victory. You have to orient towards victory, and you have to find the way to get there. It's a kind of, absolutely prudence. It's cleverness of the response in the particular moment. They find victory, even with limitation. You have to find the way through that, which I think is actually the operation of. So I think everyone's again, the idea of regurgitation versus digestion, right? The kind of regurgitation stance is to say, no, this isn't the case. It's it has to be the stamp of, and if everything isn't perfect, it's very fragile. That's what we're getting to know about fragility of the cybernetic model, based of fragility of nudging and robustness of nudging is absolutely on this point. If things are not in the right order, there's a fixedness of reification of it, and then there's a freak out. It can't respond to error. It cannot respond to limitation, to lack. You can't respond to it. It takes the nothing. But when we have the right dispositional state of health of the body and cultivation and beauty towards victory in this case, which is that's the point. So Telos, look at that example. All sports have an orientation towards victory. That's their principle. And it's the cultivation of virtues through that in the contest. That's what we're trying to do. Now, and that's the thing, notice it's diverse. That answer in golf is very different than in boxing. It's even different based on the kind of body we're working with here. If I'm a short, stocky person, that's a very different kind of victory to be achieved in boxing than a very tall, lanky individual. So these are all it's the response to contingency to achieve and actualize. That's something, it's very subtle, but it's very beautiful. And I think, obviously the theological development is absolutely the case. I think Javier's note on commenting on that individual about spiritual children, absolutely. We're all children first. And that cultivation of the practice of cultivation of the spiritual life is absolutely the same nature. The discussion of the priest or the philosopher as a doctor is very common. Augustine uses it, Plato uses it. In both those cases, the most to cultivate is to shape the soul, to treat the soul to be beautiful. Health is virtue is a kind of health, great beauty and well-working of the soul, to quote from Plato in the Republic. And vice is sickness, ugliness, and powerlessness of the soul. Which is, by the way, another note about this, all this about Telos is activity. It's a realization of activity. And I think that kind of play of the striated space and the smooth space, it kind of circle back from the beginning. It's kind of a useful heuristic slightly in the sense that smoothness that gains you fluency, that helps you have apprehension of recollection to respond to particular circumstances. That's a good smoothness, but the kind of smoothness makes you forget to not respond. And then more importantly, see the absences of the error, the difficulties as nothing, and things need to be removed. That seems to be the heuristic we're talking through together, both in our interactions of life and our digestions and spiritual development. And that's all for me.
Magnificent. I appreciate everyone being here. If anyone has final things, please, before I run and put down the chairs, is, as you were speaking on this idea of boxing, it would seem to me where you're working, like you win by getting the other to think, by getting the other to go into their mind. It is very interesting to think if perhaps that is what is constantly happening in politics and the media. They're getting us to think and to analyze. It's like that old idea with Rumsfeld. It's like, while you academics are busy studying, we're making reality and you'll study what we do, so we lead. And so the academic is always kind of just behind, right? So then this begs the question, what would it mean for the philosopher, et cetera, to take seriously what you are saying? What does it mean to train so much in thinking that you can get to the place where you can think without thinking? And what does that even mean? What does it mean to think without thinking? What does it mean to be able to kind of carry oneself philosophically without being stuck in your head, right? That would seem to be what the proper goal of philosophy is actually to do, is to get to the place where you can be philosophical without thinking philosophically, right? And you're able to respond to contingency. Well, this may ultimately suggest why this talk on embodiment and virtue, health, memory, etc., so forth, are all actually critical, because if you don't move thought into this realm, then you're always going to be in your head and you're never going to move to the expertise that is required. So I think that is a wonderful thought, and I absolutely think there is a difference between a smoothness to avoid lack versus to handle lack of fluidity that occurs in it. And there is more to say. I will go and unfold chairs this wedding season. Thank you all for being here. I've enjoyed it immensely. Cleo, I hope you feel better. Thank you for being here. Daniel, Christian, Javier, everyone, and Clayton and Mr. Jockin, thank you all. And all the best to you now.